our speakers has failed to turn up. Today we are going to discuss digitalized streets. A digitalized street provides data of different type and of different intensity and different volumes. And today, our agenda is what sort of data cities possess, how cities, businesses, and citizens can benefit from this data. I would like to start by introducing our panel.
Это руководитель, это советник.
Advisor to Vice Mayor of New York on city planning. New York does a big job in terms of technology. Their roads are of an inferior class as compared to Moscow, I would say. But Sonia will discuss with us what New York does in terms of quality of data, including for designing streets. Alexei Novikov, president of Hybridatum company. In my opinion, it's not only a Russian, but also a global leader in terms of processing of big data. Mr. Sevtsuk, professor on urban planning in Harvard. Harvard does a big job in terms of smart cities and use of big data. And Vadim Yurev, head of the Center of Organization of Traffic in Moscow. For those who are driving in Moscow and are fined for exceeding speed limits, do not forget that this is the person who looks at the camera data. Let's not throw tomatoes at him, but let's try to find out how efficiently he uses the data collected in the streets. To start with, I will give floor to Alexei Novikov. What is city data? What sort of data businesses can use? What types of data exist? And what is your perspective on what is big data and how cities can use it? Well, please, my presentation. Thank you for a very interesting question.
Спасибо за интересный вопрос.
Thank you for your question. We've been looking into the data agenda for about 5 years, and we've witnessed let's say, significant shift in terms of understanding what data is and what may be the benefits of data. In the past, we were delighted to buy products of telecoms, infrastructure companies, social media, etc., which allowed us to have a new look on our city, but we did not understand how the data is organized, what underpins it. And then we started to create a platform trying to understand better what data is. But the next question was how to interpret this data. Oftentimes, it is the key question on the agenda of any city research. It's one thing to have a lot of information. It's another thing what you can derive from this information. And there is an interesting issue here. Generally, with the prevailing trends in terms of smart cities, is that use of this data follows technology companies, and in my opinion, they're following a track which is not altogether correct. They're trying to, let's say, adjust or to qualify the information and the image of the city they have using the data which is increasingly more feasible and structured. And here, all this beautiful structure fails because this data gives us a radically new opportunity to cast a new light on the city. But our industrial-based fragmented conscience leads us to a totally different area. We look at concentrations, we understand how many people are moving in different directions, but what are we to do about that? And this is where we stop short. And the picture of smart city looks like that. All activities are focused around monitoring. There is monitoring what's going on. Nearly in real-time mode. Which is quite useless in terms of let's say, municipal planning area, it may be important for traffic control, but to understand what's going on in the city, it's not very interesting.
So all this infrastructure, the data and analytics are somehow independently used. So this is now it's the time for interpretation of that data, and the companies are now not only interpreting and selling this data, but also create some metrics which we could not even imagine before. For example, we can calculate the energy consumption of a certain place. We can also calculate how much people use while being at some place. So we can actually get some data that could have never been imagined. There are two main trends which are quite obvious. Some of the data that we receive from the operators, from the social networks, give us a hint about time. They let us understand how the city is developed through time. We can, yes, we can understand how the city is developing online, but how can we gain the benefits out of it? So this main point is the crucial point for us now. Another thing is how can be transport used but without the transport system. Likewise, the alternative solution for metro underground will be using this system to. Well, likewise, we use the underground system. We should also be available to share the commonly used other transport systems. And besides, the property transport data should be commonly used and even used one instead of another. The question of the density, transportation, and other data can be actually be even put aside if we build rental properties enough. So this is how we can even avoid solving the transport problems and the transportation problems just by using this data. So this data is pretty much diverse, and the main topic, the main goal is to somehow combine it into metrics that can be processed and analyzed. This is a certain standards that we chose for ourselves. So you can use a geotag and which is connected to a certain time. So this is how you can actually analyze this fractal system from the minimum to the maximum level of comfort, and this is how we gain the whole picture. This is the final solution that we get, the final result that they get after analyzing at the first point some very diverse data. This is how we can forecast the price change. This is how we can forecast and actually choose the right place for construction. Other from time, we can also decide on where to build, where to construct. That's when we remodel some. This is actually for our goals to remodel some district to construct more houses over there, and we can also form up some special additional functions adding to that. So these are some of the solutions that we created in this perspective. First one is called PropLocation. This is a tool for the investors and for some financial instruments, probably banks and funds, which invest part of their assets into property and then let it for rental. They need to gain a sustainable income and need to forecast their income in a certain city, in a certain district, and even on a certain street. So this exact tool is used both by the developers and by the investors. This is becoming a very, very commonly used tool. That's about risk management, right? Okay, I got 3 minutes more. The next one is, the next tool is called Chronotope Retail. We called about service retail, since 8% of the city economy is non-tradable service. You need to direct people up to them rather than bring the service to the people. No, we don't need exactly to pick up to get a certain thing, to get a certain product. You need to get it delivered. This is how traffic and logistics is becoming more important than supply of the goods themselves. The next one is modeling the cost of the property, which is used not only by the tax institutes, but also it also gives a very good knowledge on how high should be the rental fee for this or that property. On the right, you can see different property costs. So the green one is the total tax-based cost. The red one is the market cost, the market calculated cost, and finally the expected cost, which is the blue one. Here you can see a forecast of the cost of the land in the future, which will, so this land cost depends on the functions and will depend on the infrastructure that these lands will give the place. And probably the most important thing is that one. This is what we do in different cities. We actually can connect one of the functions with some others, and we come up to a certain result, which is a complex result that can be correlated. So you can nominally imagine the compliance between the place of the restaurant, like you can forecast how much how can we use this or that place, this or that land, and what kind of efficiency of usage can we get after it. We can also use this data in order to conclude it into the master plan of the city, in order to build the new parks, the new parkings, some new infrastructure parts, in order to decentralize Moscow. There is a plenty of projects like that in different countries of the world. You can get an economic benefit by enhancing the pedestrians walks, by airport construction. One of my favorite projects is New York, and using and you can see the model of you can see this model where it and get some information on how usage of a certain property or certain land depends on time. You can see what are the enterprises that closed the doors during nighttime, so that they are less used at nighttime and the daytime. So this so-called quasi-sharing so that you can forecast which places are more efficient, which places are more fitting for placing your service at. This is how we can also develop the system of rental properties and of sub-rental properties using. This is how we change the paradigm from analyzing to transactions, and then you can even form up the whole financial system that will ensure the development of its infrastructure.
Очень интересно, действительно очень актуально.
Thank you, Alexei. This is very interesting. As you know, Moscow is also very actively sharing its public places, public sites, like travel, Christmas travel, or the so-called Sunday, or the so-called weekend markets. They're all. These are all the publicly used places. Moscow gains a lot of data, and I know it for sure, as I've been working for the Moscow government for a long time. The city indeed collects a lot of data from car sharing, from common rental, and all this data gives great resources for the urban laboratories to analyze this data and then make use of it. Let me pass the floor to Alexei Novikov, to Andrei Shevtsuk, I'm sorry. So which data can you gain, which actually results can you gain from analyzing this kind of data? Hello?
As part of the story. As you know, transportation is the most dynamically changing part of urban planning today. It's a sector that was very boring to be born in or join 20 years ago, and now is one of the most vibrant sectors. There's everything from e-scooters to mass to public transportation. Everything is changing. For me, as an urban planner, the most important question is, how will these technologies shape the city? And in fact, how could we support and foster the types of transportation technologies that would actually lead to a better city? If we look at where urban transportation is today on 5 levels of uncertainty, I'll get out of the screen. We don't know, we have uncertainties whether we're going to end up with electric fleets or gasoline fleets, whether we're going to end up with automated or human-driven cars, what level of automation, level 3, 4, 5, and even if automated, then whether they're going to be fleet-based or private, and even when fleet-based, whether they're primarily going to carry single passengers or multiple passengers. Where we are today is represented by these gray lines predominantly with private transport, and one very positive lines for cities, which is the green line, which is essentially public transport. Where are we headed next? There's a lot of sort of positive expectations if you read the media about the future of AVs. In fact, the positive future has very specific trajectories in this path. One of them is already existing, which is the public transportation that's human-driven. And to have positive outcomes on streets, we would either need automated level 4 fleets that are fleet-based and shared, or level 5 fleets that are fleet-based or shared. For every one of these positive scenarios, there is in fact a trove of negative scenarios. Each one of these negative scenarios with automated electric vehicles would exacerbate or increase traffic on city streets. It would add more vehicle miles traveled on the city streets, which I consider to be a negative scenario for the future. So I want to address first 5 common myths about automated vehicles, and then conclude with 4 or 5 suggestions and recommendations for cities. First common myth that we encounter is that once we have these robo-taxis that are automated on-demand vehicles on city streets, we will actually have fewer cars and it's going to solve traffic problems. It's actually quite the reverse, because what we're witnessing is a very significant drop in price per kilometer. Currently in the United States, for instance, an Uber ride on average costs about $2 per mile. The projections, once we take the driver out of the equation, bring that cost down to about $1 per mile, which is on par with private car ownership. And that would produce a very significant increase in demand, meaning many more people will opt to ride a car rather than any other mode if the price goes so low. So indeed, we're going to witness more traffic on streets with automated transport services. Second myth, because of AVs, streets will be much safer because AVs are going to be much safer than human drivers and not run over people. In the United States, there's about 40,000 traffic casualties per year. 40,000 people are killed every year by cars. The only way that automated vehicles can actually deliver safety on city streets is that they would drive extremely carefully. They would drive like grandmothers, basically. And that's kind of what we're witnessing on the pilot projects that are already out on the roads in Arizona, where vehicles wait on the intersection until other vehicles take off, etc. And that would mean that they would, at least in the initial stages, drive much slower and more kind of carefully than human drivers. And if that is the case, then there's every incentive to lobby cities for more exclusive lanes, more exclusive space where people don't get in the way, so that they could move as fast as normal cars. And I think that's a very dangerous scenario for cities, and that we need to hold back against and not dedicate exclusive lanes or car-based exclusive AV space on city streets, and should rather prioritize back the pedestrian. Myth 3 that's commonly a misconception about AVs, that we will somehow have people sharing the vehicles. This was already addressed in the previous panel to some extent. With Ubers and Lyfts and Didis of the world, we are currently hitting a glass ceiling and unable to get people more than 20% of the rides to become shared. Uber, on average, has 20% of the rides shared between multiple passengers and 80% of the rides with a single passenger. And this ceiling is very hard to change because on-demand routing with shared vehicles fundamentally has unpredictable travel times. We don't know whether the trip will be 7 minutes or 15 minutes. It depends on who gets picked up and who gets dropped off. And that's a fundamental concern for increasing the shared mode share. Myth 4 is that somehow robotic or automated vehicles will revolutionize public transit with flexible routing. That somehow public transit will come pick you up at home and drop you off wherever you want in the city without any interchanges. This is very much tied to the previous point that with flexible routing, it actually doesn't make sense to have more than a couple of people per car. We hear a lot from the auto companies who provide those services that roughly 3 passengers per car is the most at the same time that makes sense for dynamic routing. Beyond that, passengers waste time and vehicles add miles to the city streets. So it's, I think, an overblown expectations that public transit will majorly change because of AVs in terms of routing. We will, I believe, still rely predominantly on fixed route travel, which is the most efficient and most predictable travel way. And 5, a lot of cities are currently considering whether they need to electrify the curb everywhere. This is a kind of, at least in the initial stages, a problem that we don't have a clear answer for, because if the vehicle fleets that come out, these sort of automated TNC services that we refer to as robot taxis, then they're largely probably going to start out as large fleets, with big companies running big fleets like we have already with Ubers and Lyfts, who will own the cars. And if that is the case, then they will simply be charged in depots on the edge of the city rather than having to get charged on every curb spot. Curb charging is important for individual car owners, but in the initial stages of automation, we're very unlikely to have individual car owners for AVs because it takes a team of engineers to boot up a car every morning and the costs are prohibitive. So with those sort of myths addressed, I would sort of like to ponder for a few minutes about what can cities do now as safe bets to anticipate and maybe even nudge the transportation revolution towards more positive outcomes. If you think back how streets have fundamentally changed because of transportation, it's been a really, really important, radical shift. I mean, we didn't have the concept of signalized crossings or zebras on the streets before really the 1920s and 1930s, when the car lobby actually introduced such things on the streets. And that's fundamentally changed what the streets are now. Where are we headed? So I would argue that there are 4 or 5 key takeaways that cities should be on top of. First, we need to push any of these technologies towards a higher use of public transport, shared and public modes. Whether this means 6-seaters, 12-seaters, or 50-seaters, doesn't matter, but what we need to fight against is 1-seaters, 2-seaters, and 3-seaters. Any one of those small solutions will add vehicle miles to city streets and congest cities further and sprawl them out. So having taking the driver out of the picture in public transportation could potentially free up 30% of the revenues that labor currently costs in public transport and increase the service or the frequencies by 30%, which would be very welcome. Second, I think we're at a unique point in time before the robotaxis hit the road to introduce some financial and policy instruments. I would highly suggest cities that consider this to consider COEs, or certificates of entitlement. It's essentially very similar to a medallion system in the United States, where to have the right to have a car in the city, which is a robotaxi, you would need to auction or buy a medallion that would give you that right. And these auction prices could help adjust and curtail how many cars you have in the city as a whole. Singapore has a very famous and successful system for that. 3, we need to really design streets for people, not for cars. And that's a very important point that I elaborate a little bit more on. Streets do much more than mobility. Streets are places for economic activity, places for political activity, spaces for even sleeping and living. And we need to keep in mind that streets are not just flow spaces for automobiles. And towards that end, I've been running a project at Harvard called The Future of Streets, where we collaborate with a number of cities. This is some recent work we did with the city of LA, where we focused very strongly on this idea of automated public transport that would enable you to open up significant portions of street space for other uses and communal uses, as well as light modes of mobility and bikes and so on. This requires a conception of a new urban kind of paradigm, a new urban model, where we basically try to create a city where longer trips between origins and destinations are served by transit. The last mile or the last couple of miles between transit and your home or transit and your work is shared, is achieved by walking, biking, or a drop-off service on a shared mode that could be autonomous. And then you'll have plenty of destinations to go to on foot or by bike around where you live and around where you work. Essentially trying to cut the automobile out of the picture for the future model of the city. Planning for this higher share of walkability also means that we take walking much more seriously than what we have. So some of what we do in my research group called the City Forum Lab, we develop software tools for cities to model pedestrian behavior as accurately and as seriously as we model traffic. So this is an example of how we sort of flow trips from origins to destinations along all sorts of plausible routes on the network. We build origin-destination matrices and model the flow of pedestrians at different times of the day. This is a quick example of pedestrian flows around Kendall Square in Boston that we predicted, and this is the change predicted by new redevelopment. So these black buildings here are newly built projects that Kendall Square is building, and we predicted change of pedestrian flows on every street as a result of this. I would argue that cities should require pedestrian impact analysis just like we require traffic impact analysis, because that's really what we want to increase rather than decrease. And we do those tools, and there are plugins for GIS and there are plugins for Rhino that are freely available to architects, urban planners, and designers around the world. Fourth, as already been mentioned in the previous panel, cities need to start implementing electronic management systems of the various mobility solutions that are privately operated, whether they're dockless bikes, e-scooters, car shares, Lyfts and Ubers, etc. This is a great example from Los Angeles. It's called the mobility data specification, and there are several software platforms now on the market where the city transportation agency can take charge and manage and oversee what's happening on the streets. redline off certain curbs for pickups because the street's too busy, cut off entire neighborhoods because there's a parade or something else going on in the neighborhood, and essentially have the digital tools available to manage what goes on the streets with lots of private operators. So there's lots of going on there. And fifth and last, I want to argue that some of the things that cities should do on the street right now include continue building bike lanes, because those will also service the mobility, personal mobility devices like e-scooters. Consider building high occupancy vehicle lanes on streets rather than just highways. Put out the carrot on the city streets that say, if you have more than, let's say, 4 passengers in a vehicle, you are allowed to use this lane, even if it's not a bus. And third, start designating and building out the pickup and drop-off zones, which are inevitably going to be necessary. And I'll just close by saying that, from my perspective, transportation is never just about moving people from A to B. Transportation ultimately is about what kind of a city do we want. Some transportation solutions lead us to a very specific type of city. We've done that with the automobiles in the 20th century. We don't want to repeat the same mistake again. So we need to find transportation solutions that produce the kind of city that we do want. Thank you.
Да, спасибо, Андрес. Ну,
Thank you, Andres. Really, two vivid examples how data can change the look of the cities. We have a very small-sized session. It's a sort of a revolutionary session. Alexei believes that we analyzed everything. Let's say Alexei said, stop constructing underground. Know how to use well, apartment housing, building, etc. We'll share this information with Mr. Kostulin. Others said, guys, we don't need AV transport in the cities, and even if it is there, it will not address any of our transportation problems, and research demonstrates that it may be true. I would like to pass the floor to Sonam. How New York develops, and does New York agree to such statements? Do you create any predictive models for your city planning? How do you take decisions based on data, and how New York develops in this area?
Thank you. It is very, very good to be here. I always compare New York and Moscow and as two of the world's very big metropolises, two very challenging places, and it's great to learn from each other about what you do best. Your subway system is a lot better than ours, and what we can do better. But today I actually wanted to talk quite a bit about what we're doing to open up data in our city. You have lots and lots of experts in this room who analyze the data, and planners and all sorts of policymakers who utilize this data, but oftentimes we want the public to actually have access to that data and use that data and help us make those decisions rather than us doing so in a box. So I will be talking about that. And I'm looking for a clicker. Here we go. Oh. Odd. For some reason, my photos are not showing up. Okay, well, I will improvise. My job is to do a lot of work on New York City and what it looks like in the future. So not necessarily the streets of today, as we mentioned earlier, but what should things look like in 5, 10, 20 years? And how should we as city government plan for those for that future? That includes everything from our streets to our built environment. What do our buildings look like? What does energy efficiency look like in 20 years? Where do we house our population, our growing population? New York City is going to have about 9 million people by 2040. About 50% of our residents are rent burdened, which means that they pay more than 30% in rent. We do not have enough housing for everyone. How do we build that? Where do we build it? And how do we use data to accommodate all of that? These are some statistics, I'm glad these are showing up, about to give you some context of where we are today. And you can sort of read these yourself, but my favorite one is actually the 1,600 pizza shops in New York. I believe we are the city with the most number of pizza shops per person in the world. So next time you're in New York, please have a slice of pizza. But what we actually do is we collect data on every single one of these metrics and incorporate that into our planning mechanisms. So every single ride on a bike share vehicle is logged. The route is logged, the speed is logged, the when the individual takes it out of the dock, puts it back into the dock, if the bike is repaired or needs repair, we log everything, and that's been fantastic. We also work with a number of private companies to collect their data, as is the case in Moscow, and I think in a lot of different cities around the world. In particular, in the United States, there's something called the Freedom of Information Law, which makes some of these things difficult. So any citizen of New York City can write an email to me or anybody in government and say, I want access to data. From Uber and from Lyft and Yandex and all of the other service providers in our city. And oftentimes, these providers, of course, have concerns about the privacy issues of their own users, and also, the business model that they have behind their data. So to be honest, over the past 4 or 5 years, that's been quite a good and healthy discussion between the two, between the cities between the city and the companies on what data we should access and how we should incorporate that into our systems. Over here, I had this big graph on the amount of data that is utilized across the world. There are 1.3 billion zettabytes of information flows on the internet every single day. To put that into context, you can cover the entire city of Moscow with 1 million data centers. And that's how much data is transmitted every single day. And to keep in mind, one of the things here is that 4 billion people in the world still are not online, about half of the world's population, right? So what we need to think about as policymakers and companies, individuals, whatnot, is what will happen when all of those individuals come online, and that incredible amount of data is much, much higher. And how do we go from service delivery, oftentimes in paper and PDFs and, PowerPoints that don't work, to actually using technology and data to provide those services much more efficiently and also equitably. And one of our major principles is around data for good. So I fundamentally believe that government should work with the private sector to create regulatory policies on how the data is collected, how it is utilized, how this impacts everything from worker compensation to consumer protection, privacy issues, should all be the responsibility of government and the private sector to work together to create smart legislation that is then incorporated into national frameworks and national law. One of the best things that we have done in New York City is actually in 2012, we created a law that said every single data set in New York City has to be made public. So you can actually go type in open data New York City on Google, and it will take you to this open data portal, and it has 1,700 data sets that are updated every 5 minutes. And this includes everything from our traffic analysis, our rents, and our the types of vehicles, transportation options that people are using from point A to point B, how efficient are we, and I think it's one of the greatest tools that we have in New York, and again, it's open to everyone. And again, it's about the values that you have as a city and what you want to share with your citizens to have them participate in this data revolution. And here are just a couple of them, right? But for us, it's about what are the things that are most important to users, and then how do we as city government provide that, and also provide it in a format that is machine readable and usable for the individuals who are analyzing this. In addition to that, we believe in iteration. So how quickly can we take information and feedback from our citizens and incorporate that into our open data portal and refine it. And we've been doing this since 2012, and I think we have one of the largest open data portals in the world. And one of the biggest things is about, again, user engagement. So we have about 140,000 individuals who log into the portal every single month and download data, analyze it, create their own software tools on top of that data, and all of this is open to the public. And it includes everything from public services, the location of healthcare facilities, the location of schools, how quickly you can get from point A to point B, where the sewers are clogged, where there are more rats in the city. Everything from the good, the bad, and the ugly, as I like to say, is available. And I think the best thing about this is that of the 140,000 people who use it, only about 10% are technologists, right, and sort of software engineers. The rest are people just like you and me who've taken on and are interested in the city and are interested in making it better. So here I just wanted to show a couple of different examples of visualizations that have been created from our open data portal. The first is about Airbnb listings in New York City, and it shows the density of the listings, the price, as well as sort of the different room types. And for us, this is important because we can see how tourists are going around our city and in which areas of the city we should be providing more services for tourists and encouraging people to leave Times Square. No New Yorker ever goes to Times Square. Next time you visit, please do not go there. And go into the outer boroughs and experience how much New York City has to offer. This is a visualization on motor vehicle collisions, so accidents on our streets. And of course, you can see that a high percentage of them are in this central business district in Manhattan. And again, how do we make our streets safer? How do we create better street design, more bike lanes, more dedicated bus lanes, and reduce the number of cars so that we lower this number? And then finally, this is actually a very interesting data set on educational attainment in New York City of the population. And it shows the areas in blue are the ones that are the most highly educated, and then it goes out from there. And this very much so also corresponds to income levels in these neighborhoods. And you'll see pockets where there are sort of, for example, on the Lower East Side, where the educational attainment is much lower. And we have a very large public housing developments there. And for us, a big part of city planning is to how to integrate this map so that it's not all blue in Manhattan and the rest of the colors in the outer boroughs. And that's part and parcel of our mixed use, mixed income developments on housing and school integration and a whole host of other policies that we've implemented. So had another slide. That's it for now, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and I think we will try to put up the real PowerPoint at some point. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, Sonam. Thank you very much, Sonam.
Thank you very much, Sonam. I would like to apologize on behalf of organizers for missing slides. First, I thought about Russian hackers, but probably they're engaged in Brexit and Catalonia referendum, probably next election campaign in USA. It may be just a technical snag, and probably we should blame Microsoft PowerPoint for that. Probably Microsoft PowerPoint doesn't start on Russian computers. Really, New York does a lot of things and sets trends in processing data. New York probably was the first city to create an open data portal, and in this portal there are 7,000 data sets. Well, what Alexei said, how do we interpret this data? I still cannot understand why we need a data set. How many dead dogs we find in Central Park in New York on the per hour basis. But this data may be used for planning of the municipal services, maintenance services. Vadim, has Moscow anything to respond to New York? How the intertransportation system, which includes a lot of components and gives rise to a lot of data, how Moscow uses data in the intellectual transit system, and what are the benefits for the city?
Thank you, Andrei. Can someone pass the clicker to me, please? You might probably know you might have probably seen the discussion at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum between Herman Gref. The so-called smart intellectual transport system is a very expensive but a very useful tool that brings much good for the city transport system. As people use in other industries, people have started thinking that we need to collect data in one place so that that it should be useful. I don't quite agree with that. It seems that the main point is indeed on how do we make use of the collected data. Yes, we do collect a lot of data. We have more than 400 million of tags per day. We also monitor the car sharing and other transport systems, but we can. This is how we can also control and monitor our own transport system and the publicly used transport hubs. We can predict the traffic jams and do something about it when the time comes. We put much effort into how to interpret this data, and one of the main paradigms is called ITS, the so-called Smart Transport System 2.0. This is the ecological transport, which, as Andres Sevtsuk has said, we need to invest a lot into the priority region areas in terms of the environmental transport, green transport. Moscow is one of the biggest cities, which is one of the cities which is developing this kind of program. The so-called program of 450 crossroads. We have modeled the routes and managed to decrease the waiting time by 15 minutes, increase the passage time of the public transport, and also keep the forecast accuracy by 25%. Which is equal to increasing the number of cars in the fleets of the public transport by 15%. In Moscow, there is around 450 crossroads will be constantly monitored in Moscow during this year. So artificial intelligence is now one of the most probably commonly used tools. As I said, we collect 400 million data packages per day. We can predict the traffic jams. We can picture a matrix and forecast how the city is moving, how the pedestrians are moving, how the cars are moving. Is there anyone whose car was stolen during this year? Yeah, I can see one. 5 years, there will be 5 or even 6 people whose car was stolen during the past 5-6 years. This is all due to the cameras. This system lets us monitor the current situation online, which can, of course, help the police to decrease the number of the number of the cases. We also try to decrease the number of mistakenly taken pictures of the cars that somehow break the rules, which is more than 80 million pictures per day. This is all interpreted. This is all monitored by the artificial intelligence, not by the people. This is how we managed to decrease the the errors by 30%, which is a great result. So the number of mistakes is as low as 0.0032%. More than 90 officers were replaced with artificial intelligence. This is how we can decrease the impact of the human factor and can also somehow save people's neurons and their bring some good to their health. So this is another project that we have been implementing when Andrei was deputy minister of the Moscow government. We're now monitoring 40 objects, 300,000 of objects are monitored and interpreted. More than 40 sources of the data is monitored and processed in one and in the single place. All this data is effectively processed and shows us the number of casualties per 100,000 people. Now Moscow is one of the safest cities in the whole world, because out of 100,000 people of population, only 7 casualties due to the car accidents arise now, which is a great step forward in regard to, if compared to what we had before. There is, of course, a still great way ahead, which is called S2.0, a new generation of our system. Thank you, Vadim. Recently, New York released a new decree so that all the data should be open to the public. So, how about your service? Will it be publicly used? Will it be open? Not yet. Yes, some of the data will be released by the Department of Transport. So, of course, we will follow the order of of the ministry. I apologize that we have no more time left for Q&A session. Let me say thanks to all the speakers. Thank you very much. You're really great professionals. Thank you so much for what you are doing. And it seems that after listening to after your presentations, we all know where we are moving in terms of data storage and data processing.